We are putting the Bush administration on trial. We investigate in order to expose. We document in order to indict. We arouse consciousness in order to create mass resistance.
The commission investigated the following charges. The Bush administration authorized the use of torture and abuse in violation of international law. It authorized the rendition of prisoners to foreign countries for torture interrogations. It authorized the secret detention of persons seized throughout the world. It authorized the roundup in the United States of thousands of Muslims and South Asians on various pretexts following 9/11. It used military forces to seize and detain U.S. citizens without charges on order of the President. And it authorized the assassination of persons that the President designates anywhere in the world. After 9/11, there was a wholesale roundup of thousands of young men from Muslim and South Asian countries who were held on various pretexts without charges and often incommunicado. None was ever charged with the terrorism crime.
The way that I'll start is to talk about what happened on September 12th, 2001. Immediately after the terrorist attacks, people were snatched from their homes all over the United States. And we, very early on at the Center for Constitutional Rights, began hearing about that. It took us a very long time to find those people. We went through every agency, every law enforcement agency, to find out what was going on. The first unlawful detentions and seizures that we see are what are called material witness seizures. These are people that were seized by the Justice Department. To the best that we can guess, that we think there were 70 people. There might have been hundreds. All of them, except for one individual, were Muslim. They were seized under the auspices of a very narrow federal law that permits the arrest and very brief detention of material witnesses who have important information about a crime, and there's a fear that they might flee to avoid testifying before a grand jury. Although the federal officials say that they suspected these men of involvement in terrorism, they held them only as witnesses and not as criminal suspects. So what happened to these people? Well, they were actually never brought before a grand jury to testify. The U.S. government apologized to about 15 of them for wrongfully detaining them. About 3 were charged with crimes out of the more than 70. Many remain in U.S. custody today.
The U.S. claims enemy combatants can be held anywhere in the world and held outside the protection of international law.
In December of 2001 is when George Bush authorizes George Tenet to create the Special Access Program. It is the first official foray into secret detention, and it enables the roundup and secret detention of a number of people. They're listed in the indictment, and they're held without any contact whatsoever with the outside world. A memo that goes from Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. He writes a memo to George Bush, I think, which everyone here knows about, telling him that, you know what, you don't really have to apply the Geneva Conventions to the people that we're going to detain during these wars. You know, those are quaint things. They're kind of cute, but we don't need them anymore. That January 2002 memo is happening at the same time that we are starting to send people to Guantanamo. And in the end, Bush issues a memo stating that the Geneva Conventions do not apply to the detainees in Guantanamo. And that's in February. And that is at the same time that we are starting to ship people by the plane load to Guantanamo.
The Bush administration has engaged in a systematic program of torture of detainees. It has sought to explain away its actions as either not reaching the threshold of torture or, alternatively, sought to hide its behavior through holding them in undisclosed locations and or off the books in identified facilities, so-called ghost detainees.
They're subject to torture. We now know what those tortures are: waterboarding, beatings, electrical shock, extreme temperatures, denial of pain medication when people were shot, severe burning, threats of death and sexual assault of family members. And this is also now, we now know, one of the first, instances that we're aware of yet of detainees dying in U.S. detention.
I took up my post in August of 2002. I came into contact with victims of torture almost immediately, with victims and their families and others who had photographic and written and other evidence of the torture going on. I attended a dissident trial in which people gave moving and very believable testimony of the torture they had faced. And at that trial, people were, one old gentleman had signed a statement to say that his nephews had traveled to Afghanistan to meet Osama bin Laden. He broke down in the middle of a testimony and he said, "I can't go on. It's a lie. They tortured my children in front of me until I signed this." And then that testimony turned out to be identical, almost word for word, to the repeated CIA intelligence that was coming. The US Embassy says, yes, they think it probably does come from torture, but they don't see that as a problem. I was summoned back. I penned 2 telegrams, one in November of 2002 and one in February of 2003, back to London, complaining about our use of intelligence got through torture, which we were receiving from the CIA, and stating that I believe this to be not only immoral and useless, but illegal also. I was summoned back to a meeting in March, I believe the 8th of March 2003, at which the Foreign Office's Chief Legal Advisor, Sir Michael Wood, informed me that the official position was it was not illegal for us to obtain information got under torture, provided we neither did the torturing ourselves nor requested that a specific named individual be tortured.
An August 2nd, 2002 memo that's provided to Alberto Gonzalez by J.S. Bybee, then of the Justice Department. And it's quite a comprehensive memo. It talks about what the traditional definitions of torture are under U.S. law, under the War Crimes Statute in the United States, under the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, and under international law, under the Convention Against Torture and those things. And it says that a very good case can be made for redefining torture. And the definition that is recommended in that memo is that torture really is only when someone is at risk of complete organ failure or death. And that is the new definition of torture in the United States, according to this administration. And then the memo proceeds to, in addition to redefining the term torture, examine all of the ways that the government could avoid liability, even if its actions meet that definition of torture.
One of the most famous pictures from Abu Ghraib, of course, is the body of Monad al-Jamadi wrapped in ice. He was arrested at his home and put up a fight. He was then bound. He was flipped into a Humvee. He was kicked and beaten and hit with a rifle butt while he was transported to Camp Jenny Ponzi just outside of Baghdad. There, a medic was in the room as he was saying, "I can't breathe. I feel like I'm going to die." He was admitted to Abu Ghraib in the early hours of the morning. He was admitted as a CIA ghost prisoner. Now, what this meant was that he was not given the customary medical enrollment. In fact, he wasn't registered in the prison at all. He was naked, he was cold, he was complaining of shortness of breath. His head was in a sandbag, and then he was tied to, his wrists were tied together behind his back and then lifted up and tied to a window bar behind him, so that if he sank down, that his shoulders would be wrenched. And in fact, about an hour later, he did sink down. Now, keep in mind the man was in a sandbag over his head, and he was found to have died. Now, at that point, the Army did an autopsy, but the autopsy was concealed, as was the death certificate. It did find that he died of torture. And in fact, the first time we learned of this case was about 6 months after it happened.
One of the main proponents of this in October of 2002 is Jeffrey Miller. He is the one who requests authorization for the use of torture techniques at Guantanamo. People were subject to horrible extremes of temperature. They were deprived of food or water. They were shackled to the floor in stressed positions for days on end. They were subject to sleep deprivation for weeks and weeks on end. They were denied medical care. People lost limbs, lost eyes, lived for years now with broken backs, with broken spines. And that is the system that was put into place by Jeffrey Miller. The last piece of this is when Rumsfeld individually decides that Miller should now be shipped off to Iraq to take the practices that he's honed and figured out are the most helpful and bring them in his kit bag to implement there.
Well, Major General Jeffrey Miller was the commander of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. He was neither a military intelligence officer or a military police officer. In fact, he was a field artillery officer, a combat arms officer who was specifically selected by the Secretary of Defense to go to Guantanamo Bay and run the interrogation operation. And he was then subsequently sent to Iraq by Secretary Rumsfeld and Undersecretary Cambone to work with the military intelligence personnel to teach them new and improved interrogation techniques to obtain more actionable intelligence from their interrogation efforts. They invited me to come over for the introductory briefing, and during that briefing, he was talking almost in generic terms about using harsher techniques of interrogation, and he wasn't specific. And one of the interrogators, a warrant officer in the Military Intelligence Command, raised his hand and asked a question, and he said, you know, sir, we think that we're doing a pretty good job because we're using the techniques that we've used previously. What would you recommend that we do right away if you can see some improvements that we can make quickly? And he said, look, it's my opinion that you're treating the prisoners too well. At Guantanamo Bay, the prisoners know that we are in charge, and they know that from the very beginning. You have to treat the prisoners like dogs. Everything that General Miller told Colonel Pappas, General Fast, and General Sanchez to do, whether they were recommendations or directions, they did those things. And they did as many of them as they could while he was there. And General Sanchez himself signed the 8-page memorandum authorizing literally a laundry list of harsher techniques in interrogations to include the use of dogs and unmuzzled dogs with his specific permission following General Miller's visit.
It's a bit difficult to stand up here as a soldier and talk about what's legal or illegal in the war because, quite frankly, we received no training. The first mission that we had in Iraq was in a place called Al-Assad. The first thing they told us was that we could not call this place a prisoner of war camp because it did not meet the criteria by the International Red Cross. For instance, there was no medical facility around, there were no ambulances outside, a number of conditions that had to be met in order for us to run a prisoner of war camp were not present at the time, so we were told to just simply call it a detention camp. Then our job was to keep these prisoners from sleep deprivation. And when we were receiving the training, we saw that there was this soldier who was yelling at the detainees. And they said, well, if you yell at them enough, you know, they're kind of like dogs. You know, you yell at a dog enough and the dog will get it.
On people being boiled to death by total body immersion in boiling liquid, I only have 2 definite documented cases, the 2 of which I'm absolutely certain. In one case, Mr. Avazov, who was a Muslim dissident held in the Jazlik Gulag, his body was delivered back to his mother in a sealed casket. His mother, who was an old lady, was ordered not to remove the body from the casket. She, in the middle of the night, secretly got the casket open, got the body onto the kitchen table, and took a number of detailed photographs, which she got to me. I sent them to the University of Glasgow pathology laboratory, who produced a report based on the photographs in which they said that the gentleman's fingernails had been pulled out, his face had been severely beaten, and he'd been immersed in boiling liquid until he died. And it was immersion, not splashing, because there was a clear tide mark around the upper chest and upper limbs, and 100% scalding underneath.
That is part of the legacy of a secret presidential order that was signed by the president, apparently authorized more than 39 secret detention centers in countries outside the United States, and it apparently also authorizes practices that would, quote, not be acceptable within the United States.
Ethnic Uzbeks, who may have been Uzbek or Afghan nationals, were being brought back from Bagram airport on a regular basis from the big prisoner detention center at Bagram airport and handed over to the security service. In at least 3 cases, the person then disappeared, and my belief from general experience is they're probably dead.
The first one I saw was the pile of naked detainees stacked together, and all you could see was their butts, excuse me for saying this, but all you could see was their butts and their balls stacked on top of each other, and the smiling faces of 2 soldiers who belonged to the 800th MP Brigade behind them. One was a long-angle shot of the cell block where there was a man putting naked detainees in a configuration. And when I said, I asked about, what about everybody else in the photograph? Because they're certainly not all MPs. And the commander of the CID said to me, "You're right, ma'am. There are military intelligence soldiers, there's a medic in there, and there's civilians." And I said, "What are the translators doing in the cell block?" Because they were not allowed. And he said, "Oh, they're not translators, ma'am. Those are contract interrogators." I went down to Abu Ghraib the next morning, and nobody could talk about anything. They didn't know. The people that were there, the Grainers, the Englands, the Fredericks, they'd all been removed, not only from their duty positions, but from Abu Ghraib. And they were being held in another location. I asked generic questions. I heard some reference to photographs. Do you know anything about photographs? No, knew nothing about photographs. I did go through cell block 1A. I spoke to the sergeant there, and I said, what is going on? He said, "Ma'am, I don't know. I don't work here, but they told me to come over here because I worked here before." And I said, "Where are your logs? Let me see if I can kind of put this together." And he said, "We don't have any logs. They took everything." So we started a new one. And I said, any files, memorandums? And he said, "The only memorandum is this one that's posted out here." And it was posted on a column in the cell block right outside this little admin office that they were using. That memorandum was signed by the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. It was 1 page, and he authorized sleep deprivation, stress positions, meal disruption, serving their meals late, not serving a meal, leaving the lights on all night long, playing loud music, issuing insults or criticism of their religion, their culture, and their beliefs. In the margin on the left-hand side, it said, "Make sure this happens," with 2 exclamation points. And it was written alongside of the list of the interrogation techniques.
President Bush has used the military to seize people inside the United States and hold them outside the law.
There are 3 men that fall in this category that have been confined in the U.S. after being declared enemy combatants by the president. What happens when you are picked up under an enemy combatant declaration is that you are taken immediately into military custody. You are taken into custody by the Department of Defense. It's pretty clear that this is not a criminal justice system issue. For Jose Padilla, this is what it looked like. Mr. Padilla was arrested initially as a material witness, that last category, when his lawyer filed a habeas petition to say, look, he's not running out of anywhere. He's a U.S. citizen. And before her motion was heard about getting him released and into the city in New York, on a Sunday afternoon, the president authorized the Department of Defense to go into court to call the judge on an emergency basis, ex parte, without notice to defense counsel, have him declared an enemy combatant, seized and taken into military custody. All three of these detainees went to court to challenge the legality of their detention under the habeas corpus mechanism. And in every case, the government took the position that the president has the authority to decide this status unilaterally, that it is not subject to any authorization by Congress, that there doesn't have to be a law in place that decides or specifies what this status is, and that the individual is not entitled to a judicial hearing on the facts or the legality of their detention. Wherever I speak, people say, could that be any American? Yeah. Yeah.
The Bush administration has sought to concentrate unquestioned power in the hands of the executive branch of government, claiming that the powers of the president as commander-in-chief trumps the law in time of war.
What this sort of gets to also is this effort to consolidate power in the hands of the executive branch at the expense of both the judiciary and Congress, right? There's a repeated refrain that the judges don't have authority to look at this, and Congress doesn't have authority to legislate on any of these issues.
If 10 years ago anyone had told you that our two countries would be leading the world in developing torture, no one would have believed it. I would personally rather die than have anyone tortured to save my life.
Horrible tortures happened in Guantanamo, and now we face a terrible situation where many of the people have decided that they're going to participate in a hunger strike until death or until they get a hearing. And now in the context of that, in that context, the United States has decided that it is authorized to be singularly brutal in the treatment and force feeding of people. They are using unsterilized equipment. They are force feeding people through nasal gastric tubes in unsterile environments, using tubes from other people that have gone into a coma. People have been beaten when they've tried to talk to their lawyers and complain about the treatment.
I went to meetings with colleagues of mine, people I had known for over 20 years, ordinary, nice people who were setting down on paper strategies by which what we were doing could be said not to circumvent the UN Convention Against Torture. And I was looking at them thinking, I know you. I know you. We've drunk together. We've played golf together. You are setting out a justification for torture. How did this come? And this may sound exaggerated, but it isn't. At that moment, I understood how some civil servant ended up writing out the orders for cattle trucks to go to Auschwitz and felt they were only doing their job. And ladies and gentlemen, that is what we face now.
On June 28, 2004, the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts may hear habeas corpus petitions from prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay. As a result, on December 30, 2005, President Bush signed the Detainee Treatment Act, which stripped federal courts of the power to hear habeas petitions from prisoners at Guantanamo. On June 29, 2006, the Supreme Court ruled that all persons held by the Bush regime are entitled to the protections of Geneva Conventions, and that Bush's proposed military tribunals are illegally constituted. As the result, Congress is considering new legislation to legalize Bush's military tribunals.